Welcome back everyone to another Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing setup. In today's video, we'll be focusing on the 410s at Jacobs County. Now this 1/3 mile track is listed at mid banking, but I can assure you there is plenty of banking here to run wide open if you so desire. I find that my best times, however, are backing off the throttle just a little bit, maybe only 5 to 10%. Going into the corner, maybe using a little bit of brake to get the car pointed and get it right down to the bottom of the track in the corners, and then letting the car come right out to the wall on the straightaways. Those are where I get my best lap times, but of course, when you're in traffic, you have the ability to move around anywhere from the very bottom of the track all the way to the top, riding the rim the entire way through the corner. Plenty of room to race here. Let's get to the setup. How you drive the car will ultimately decide a lot about the setup. For me in particular, this is not the setup that I had initially wanted to go with on here on the channel, but as I continued driving more and more on the track and I became more and more patient with the throttle, then this is the setup that I ultimately decided on because it was the most stable and gave me the most consistent lap times when I was patient. Now, if I want to go with a more aggressive driving style and be either wide open or very close to wide open the entire way around the track, then I need to make some adjustments, and those are the kind of things that we'll talk about as we move along. We'll begin our setup discussion with the shock values. And here you see a lot of 3s and 4s across the board, which are either at or very close to the minimums. And I did that because there are a few bumps to contend with depending on which groove you run on the track, and by running the minimum values here, that completely removed any bumps from the equation, so I was just able to focus on other aspects. However, you can certainly get by running much higher numbers here, up closer to the maximum. Again, it'll all depend on the feel you're looking for. If you're looking for a much quicker feel, a much stiffer feel out of the car, then you'll want to run higher numbers, and of course you can always adjust the car corner to corner in order to really dial in that setup. But for me, running the softer values much closer to the minimums or at the minimums worked out better for me. It gives me a much softer feel, more forgiving feel to the car. Moving on now to the weight settings, maximum left side weight, and also in a change from what I've been running at most every other track, and maybe in fact every other track to this point, I am using maximum front weight. So normally we'd be using about 38.5 here, but for Jacobs County, I'm running 39.5, and that goes back to the driving style. I found that using more front weight, which will generally tighten up the car, slow down the rotation, that's exactly what I needed for this track in order to keep the car stable as I was working the gas and the brake a little bit more, and also spending more time focusing on getting through traffic as best as possible. So that 39.5 worked out really well there. However, if you need to loosen the car up, if you need the car to rotate more overall, then drop this number down to around 39.0 or even the minimum at 38.5, and that will certainly free the car up. Cross weight has become pretty standard for me to run at the maximum 55.0% as much as possible. And this, similar to what I mentioned with the front weight, really helps to stabilize the car. The more cross weight you put in the car, the tighter the car will be, the slower the rotation of the car will be. And that is absolutely what I'm looking for at most every track. I want to control the car because as much as I'm looking for overall speed, I'm also looking for the ability to get through traffic as best as I can. So if you're finding that the car is just simply too tight for you, it doesn't rotate enough, then try dropping this number down by 1% or 2%. Try it out again and see if that doesn't help with your handling. Now, the front and rear ride heights really don't do a whole lot here other than to keep you from bottoming out. So basic rule of thumb for this game is that just get these as low as you can without having to worry about bottoming the car out. So I generally run a little bit higher in the front than the rear, and that worked out just fine. Moving on now to the torsion bar diameters. Once again, I prefer to run at least the left sides on the minimum, which is 0.95. So you'll notice that both the left front and the left rear are at those values. The real trick to the handling comes in what you do with the right side of the car. More traditional for me is to use a 1.0 for the right front, and that gives me a couple of clicks of difference between the left front and the right front. But here, I wanted the car to rotate a little bit more, so I dropped that right front down by 1 click. However, I find that, as we talked about at the beginning, the more aggressive I am with the car, the more aggressive I am with the throttle, I might need to bump this up a click or two just to add a little bit more stability under the full throttle conditions. But here, because I was more patient with the throttle, I found that I could really lower this down to only 1 click of difference. Now, one thing I generally don't like to do is use the same from the left front to the right front, same thing in the rear of the car as well. It introduces a little bit of instability that I don't like, a feel from the car that I don't like. So I always like to have at least 1 click of difference between the left and the right side, whether we're talking about front or the rear of the car. But again, the looser you want the car to be, particularly on corner entry and overall as well, the lower the number you'll use here on the right front. However, you notice that I'm also using 2.0 on the preload. So I'm using quite a bit of preload here, and that is simply to keep the car under control. Tighten up the car a little bit and control the rotation overall. The higher the number you use here for the right front preload, the tighter the car will be, particularly on entry. The lower the number you use here, the closer you get to 0 or even lower, the looser the car will be overall. So keep that in mind. This is a very good adjustment that I find for me and my driving style to really adjust the rotation of the car in combination with some of the other things we talk about. Moving on now to the rear of the car. Once again, minimum in the left rear and just 1 step higher and 1 click higher in the right rear. If you want to tighten the car up, you use a little bit lower number here as I'm doing. Again, just keeping that 1 click difference between the left rear and the right rear. However, if I want to loosen up the car, then I've got a couple of options here. I can either increase this number to 1.0 or even higher, or I can come in and increase the preload in the right rear. Both of those will loosen the car overall. Now, if you want to tighten the car, then another option you have is come into this left rear and either increase the left rear torsion bar diameter or increase the preload in the left rear. That will also tighten the car up, particularly from the center of the corner on exit. So again, a lot of different options to loosen and or tighten the car. As always, didn't spend a lot of time on the tire pressures. I moved them around some, really didn't see anything more than minor differences for me. So I choose to, whenever that's the case, leave them pretty much at default or make small changes. In this case, small change to the right rear was about all I ultimately wanted to do. So the lower the right rear tire pressure, the tighter the car will be overall. The more you increase this number, the looser the car will be overall. But again, this is a very minor adjustment for me overall in this particular game. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings. And this is another departure for me from what I've been using at most all of the other tracks. And that is using the minimum left rear wheel spacing. Traditional for me is to use both a maximum left rear spacing as well as the right rear spacing. Here, I have dropped the left rear down to the minimum, and that was simply to help the car to rotate more, particularly from the center of the corner on exit. Remember what I said at the beginning, I'm being very patient with the throttle overall at this track, so having a little bit of extra help rotating the car from the center to the exit really helped out with that. If I find that I'm going to be more aggressive with my driving style, more aggressive on the throttle, or even try to run this track wide open, then I would generally want to increase this number up to about 14.0 or even the maximum of 14.5 just to add some stability to the car. But as always, the lower the number you use in the left rear spacing, the looser the car will want to be, the more it'll want to rotate. The higher the number, the tighter the car will be under throttle. The right rear is the exact opposite. The higher the number you use in the right rear spacing, the looser the car will be, the more the car will want to rotate. The lower the number you use in the right rear, the tighter the car will be. Brake bias is something that I use at this track in order to help the car to rotate on corner entry. It's not much. It's more or less just dragging the brake just a little bit, only a few percent to get the car to rotate and get it to where I need it on the track. So almost I use the brake like a steering mechanism for the most part. So a higher number here, around 65%, which is certainly higher than I've been using at most tracks. But I really wanted to allow the car to rotate while tighten it up a little bit with the brake bias. So the higher the number you use for the brake bias, the tighter the car will be. The more the car will want to go straight when you get on the brakes. The lower the number you use for brake bias, the more the car will want to rotate under braking. So again, that is a very easy way to help the car to rotate or tighten it up some, depending on the other values in the setup that you're using. Moving on now to the wings. Once again, maximum 30 degrees in front and rear, and no offset here in the position. So essentially, I wanted the maximum aero I could get. The more downforce, the more grip, and ultimately the more speed. The only reason to really lower these would be at this particular track, because drag is not really an issue here. The only real reason to lower these would be if you needed to adjust the aero balance. For example, if you find that the car is just too loose overall, then drop the front wing number to 28, 26 or so on, and that should really tighten the car up a good bit. For me, I chose not to adjust with that simply because I find that it really hurts my corner exit to drop this front wing value. So I decided to leave it at the max and adjust some other things in the setup to tighten up the car. Another way to tighten up the car would be to change the rear wing position. The more negative this number gets, the more the rear wing is pushed to the rear of the car, which tightens it up. So try a few clicks on this particular setting, and that will certainly tighten up the car. Also stabilize the car. So if you're finding the car is just too unstable, adjusting this rear wing position can certainly help with that. The wheel lock at 10 degrees, which is standard for me. The lower this number becomes, the slower the steering reaction time will be. The higher you use for this number, up around the defaults of 17 or 18, will make for much quicker steering. So it's all about the feel that you're looking for out of the car. And I prefer a little bit slower feel than the defaults that come with the game. Steering offset at 1.5. This is a number that I've used anywhere from around 1.0 all the way up to about 2.0. It all depends on the feel you're looking for. The lower this number, the more time you'll spend turning to the right. The higher this number goes, the less time you'll spend turning to the right. So again, all depends on the feel that you're looking for, and it's tied very closely to the stagger. So the more stagger I'm running, the more steering offset I will traditionally run. The lower the stagger number, the lower the steering offset will need to become, simply because if you get too high with the offset versus the amount of stagger you're running, you can actually introduce a pull to the right from the car, which can be very disconcerting when you're trying so hard to carry maximum speed. So in this case, I actually tested out running stagger as low as about 16 or 17, and I got very good lap times. In fact, the lower the number you use on the stagger, the tighter the car will become, the more stable the car will become overall. However, in order to maintain maximum speed and feel in the car that I was looking for, maximum stagger of 20.0 is what I ended up going with. But certainly don't be afraid to drop this stagger number. Just be ready for the car to tighten up overall, and you'll need to make some other adjustments in the setup to get that rotation back in the car. Rear end ratio, 5.5 is about max RPM, is about as much as I could push the engine. You might be able to get a little bit higher depending on the lap times that you're running. Again, my quicker lap times were somewhere around 11 flat. So if you're a little quicker than that, then you might want to drop this number a little bit to give yourself a little bit more room on the top end of RPM. Or if you're running a little slower than that, you might be able to get by with a 5.6, 5.7 maybe even. So you've got some room to play around in that area, again, just based on the lap times you get overall. So thank you very much for joining me. That'll do it for today, and stay tuned for more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing.